Welcome to Void Case Files. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I need to mention something important. 94.7% of you watching right now aren't subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy these deep dives into the unexplained, please hit that subscribe button. We're pushing hard to reach 1,000 subscribers by New Year's, and we're currently at 676. With your help and our commitment to posting daily videos, we can get there together. Now, let's get into tonight's case. Have you ever wondered what secrets Yellowstone holds when the campfires die out and the stars blanket the sky? Park rangers know. They've seen things, heard things, and experienced things that defy explanation. Tonight, we reveal the terrifying true accounts of what lurks in the shadows, far beyond the well-worn paths, once night truly descends upon Yellowstone. The high country air was thin and cold that summer morning in 1978. Robert Jackson sat easy in his saddle, his horse's hooves finding purchase on the rocky trail as they climbed into the Fan Creek drainage. Behind him, a licensed outfitter kept pace, leading 2 pack animals loaded with gear. The pine forest pressed close on both sides, dense and ancient, branches interlocking overhead to create a tunnel of shadow even at midday. Bob Jackson, though most just called him Action Jackson. The nickname had been earned through blood, sweat, and more close calls than he cared to remember. 30 years he'd given to Yellowstone, and he'd logged over 50,000 miles on horseback, through country that would swallow a man whole if he made one wrong move. The thoroughfare region was his domain, that vast stretch of wilderness where roads didn't reach and cell towers would never stand. Out here, grizzlies outnumbered people 10 to 1. Out here, you were truly alone with whatever the wilderness decided to show you. The morning had started like 100 others. Bob and the outfitter had left the trailhead at dawn, the horse's breath creating small clouds in the cold air. They'd crossed 3 ridges already, following game trails that Bob knew by heart. The outfitter, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who'd been guiding in these mountains for 15 years, was chatty at first. Talking about elk populations, about the clients he'd be bringing through in the fall, about the new regulations coming down from park administration. But as they climbed higher into the Fan Creek drainage, Gerald had gone quiet. Bob noticed it, the way the man kept glancing into the trees, the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle on his saddle. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The forest felt different up here, older, more watchful. They were 4 hours into country where most tourists never ventured, following the creek bed as it wound between steep canyon walls. The water rushed over smooth stones, creating a constant white noise that should have been peaceful. Should have been. But Bob felt it too now, that prickle on the back of his neck, that sensation of being observed. His horse, a steady mare named Copper who'd been with him for 8 years, suddenly went rigid, her ears swiveled forward, locked on something up the canyon. Bob's hand moved instinctively to the bear spray on his belt. That's when the sound started. At first, Bob thought it was wind moving through the canyon, but the branches weren't moving. The aspens that dotted the hillside stood perfectly still. The sound came from up the drainage, maybe a mile distant, rolling down the canyon like distant thunder. Except it wasn't thunder. It wasn't anything Bob had ever heard before. He pulled Copper to a stop, one hand raised. Behind him, Gerald's horse danced nervously. The pack animals bunched together, ears pinned back. The sound was continuous, unbroken. It just kept going, building in intensity as it echoed off the canyon walls. Bob felt it in his chest, in his bones, a vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to some ancient part of his brain, the part that still remembered when humans were prey. In 3 decades of wilderness work, Bob had catalogued every sound these mountains could produce. The bugle of elk during the rut, that high-pitched scream that could echo for miles and send chills down your spine. The howl of wolves on a winter night, lonely and wild and utterly free. The cough of a mountain lion, that sound that made horses bolt and seasoned rangers check their weapons. The huffing challenge of a grizzly defending a kill, warning you that you'd stumbled into a place you shouldn't be. This was none of those. The tone was wrong, too sustained, too deliberate. It rose and fell, but never quite stopped, just modulated through frequencies that seemed designed to inspire dread, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison, but not human voices, not animal voices either. Something in between that made his scalp prickle and his hands tighten on the reins until his knuckles went white. The sound filled the valley completely, bouncing off canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, above them, below them, from the dark spaces between the trees. Bob's rational mind tried to grasp onto an explanation. Acoustic phenomenon, wind through a cave opening, geological activity from the volcanic system beneath the park. But none of those explanations fit. None of them accounted for the purposefulness he heard in that sound, the intelligence. Gerald's horse spooked, spinning in a tight circle. Bob heard the man swear, heard the creak of leather as he fought to keep his seat. The pack animals pulled at their leads, eyes rolling white, nostrils flared. Even Copper, steady, reliable Copper who'd faced down grizzlies without flinching, trembled beneath him. The sound continued for 3 full minutes, maybe 4, long enough that Bob's rational mind cycled through every possible explanation and discarded each one. Long enough that the primitive part of his brain, the part that still carried the genetic memory of being hunted, started screaming at him to leave, to turn around, to get out of this canyon while he still could. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush, no chirping of insects or chattering of squirrels. Even the creek seemed quieter, as if the water itself was holding its breath. The entire forest had gone still, waiting. Bob sat motionless in his saddle, every sense straining. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cold. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for shapes that didn't belong. The shadows between the pines seemed darker than they should be, deeper. "What the hell was that?" Gerald's voice cracked on the last word. The man's face had gone pale, his jaw tight. Bob shook his head slowly. He didn't have an answer, and that bothered him more than the sound itself. In 30 years as a ranger, Bob had prided himself on understanding the wilderness, on being able to read the signs, interpret the sounds, know what was natural and what wasn't. This shattered that confidence completely. They continued up the trail, but the day had fundamentally changed. The shadows seemed deeper now, more threatening. Every snapped twig made them both turn. Every rustle in the brush put Bob's hand on his bear spray. Copper remained on edge, ears constantly swiveling, alert for any repeat of that sound. They completed their patrol, checked Gerald's permits and campsite locations, discussed the routes his hunting parties would take in the fall. All routine business, but neither man was really focused on it. They both kept glancing back over their shoulders, kept scanning the forest, kept waiting for that sound to start again. It didn't. The rest of the day passed in tense, watchful silence. When they finally headed back down the mountain, both horses moved faster than usual, eager to put distance between themselves and whatever had made that sound. They reached the trailhead as the sun touched the western peaks. Gerald loaded his pack animals quickly, hands moving with practiced efficiency but more haste than usual. Before he mounted up, he turned to Bob. "You going to report this?" Bob considered. Report what exactly? That they'd heard a strange sound, that it had scared them. "I'll make a note in my log," he said finally. Gerald nodded, but his expression said he didn't think much would come of it. "I've been guiding in these mountains for 15 years, he said quietly. "Never heard anything like that, not even close." He paused, seemed to wrestle with something. "My grandfather used to guide up here in the 40s. He told me once that there were sounds in these mountains that didn't belong to any animal he knew. I thought he was just telling stories, old man stuff." He looked back up at the mountains, at the dark line of trees. Maybe he wasn't. Bob watched Gerald ride away, then drove his truck back to the ranger station in the gathering dusk. The radio played country music, familiar and comforting. The outside world with its predictable sounds and explainable phenomena. But his mind kept returning to that canyon, to that sound, to the absolute certainty he'd felt that something up there had been aware of them, had maybe even wanted them to hear it. That night, back at the ranger station, Bob sat alone in the small bunk room with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. The other rangers had turned in early, exhausted from their own patrols. Bob kept replaying the sound in his mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into some category that would make it less disturbing. The canyon could do strange things with acoustics, he knew that. He'd heard echoes that sounded like voices, wind through rocks that moaned like something alive. But that didn't explain the sustained nature of what he'd heard, didn't explain the way it had seemed to pulse with intention, with purpose. He pulled out his patrol log and stared at the blank page. What could he write? Heard unidentified sound at approximately 11:43 a.m. Fan Creek drainage approximately 4 miles from trailhead. It sounded inadequate. Clinical. It didn't capture the visceral impact of the experience. The fear. In the end, he wrote a brief notation. Time, location, basic description. Then he closed the log and tried to sleep. But every time he drifted off, he heard that sound again in his dreams, felt it resonating in his chest. And in his dreams, he would look up and see something standing at the edge of the tree line. Something tall and dark that watched him with eyes that held far too much intelligence. He started asking questions the next day, quietly at first, carefully over coffee with other rangers, or during supply runs into the small towns that bordered the park. You ever hear anything strange out in the backcountry? Most gave him odd looks. A few laughed it off, made jokes about tourists hearing elk and thinking it was Bigfoot. But some, the ones who'd spent real time in the deep wilderness, their expressions shifted when he asked. They'd lean in, lower their voices, glance around to make sure no one else was listening. An old-timer named Frank Delaney had been working Yellowstone for 25 years before Bob even arrived. Frank was in his 60s now, weathered and tough as old leather, with eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Bob found him one afternoon in the maintenance shed, working on a chainsaw. Strange sounds? Frank set down the chainsaw and wiped his hands on a rag. You heard something, didn't you? Bob nodded. Up in the Fan Creek drainage a few weeks back. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying Bob's face. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. Let me tell you about the Mountain Creek crew. The story Frank told was from 1973, 5 years before Bob's experience at Fan Creek. A trail crew had been working on the Mountain Creek Trail, deep in the park where tourists rarely ventured. 6 men, all experienced wilderness workers. They'd been clearing deadfall, repairing drainage, the routine maintenance that kept the backcountry trails passable. On their 3rd day out, they'd found something that made them stop work completely. An elk carcass in dense forest, maybe 50 yards off the trail. But it wasn't the carcass itself that disturbed them. It was the way it had been processed. Completely deboned, Frank said, his voice quiet. Every scrap of meat stripped away clean. But not like a bear would do it. Not torn apart. More like it had been butchered. Precise. Methodical. The crew foreman, a man named Tom Patterson who'd worked in the park for 15 years, had examined it carefully. Fresh kill, maybe a day old. But no blood trail leading to it. No drag marks, as if the elk had been killed somewhere else and carried to this spot. Next to the carcass, pressed into soft earth, were tracks. Large tracks. The crew measured them. 14 inches long. 5 distinct toe impressions. But the stride length, the distance between prints suggested something with legs much longer than any human. And the depth of the impressions indicated significant weight. Tom said they were unlike anything he'd ever seen, Frank continued. He'd tracked everything in these mountains. Bear, human, elk, moose, everything. These didn't match. The crew had discussed what to do. They were 3 days deep into the backcountry, with supplies for another 4 days of work. Tom decided they should document what they'd found, take some photographs, and continue with their job. They were professionals. They'd seen strange things before. That afternoon, as they worked on the trail, they heard it. A sound from deep in the forest. Howls, but not wolf howls, not coyotes, something else. The sound made the hair on their arms stand up, made their mouths go dry. One of the younger crew members, a kid fresh out of forestry school, actually dropped his tools and backed away. Tom tried to keep them working, Frank said. Told them it was probably wolves or maybe elk fighting, but nobody believed him. They could all hear it, and it didn't sound like any animal they knew. The howls continued for maybe 5 minutes, moving, circling their position, as if whatever was making the sound was checking them out, studying them. When it finally stopped, the forest went absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Tom Patterson, veteran of 15 years in the wilderness, made a decision right there. They were leaving, not in the morning, not after they packed up properly, right then. They abandoned their tools where they lay, saddled the horses and rode out. You don't ride in the dark if you can help it, Frank said. Not in grizzly country, not through mountain terrain with a string of pack horses. But they did it anyway. Rode 18 miles through the night to reach the Park Point cabin on Yellowstone Lake. Got there around 3 in the morning, horses lathered and blown, men shaking. Frank paused, met Bob's eyes. Tom never went back for those tools. Wrote them off as lost. Preferred to take the hit on the equipment cost, rather than return to that area. Bob absorbed this. Did he file a report? Oh, he filed something. Abandoned site due to bear activity. That's what it said officially, but I talked to Tom a few years later before he retired, asked him straight what they'd really heard out there. You know what he told me? Frank's expression was grave. He said, Frank, in all my years in these mountains, I learned one thing. There's some questions it's better not to ask, and there's some things it's better not to see. Bob thanked Frank and walked out into the afternoon sun. The story settled over him like a weight. He wasn't alone in this. Others had heard things, seen things, experienced things that didn't fit the official narrative of what lived in Yellowstone's wilderness. Over the next few weeks, Bob heard other stories. A backcountry camper caught without a permit in the northeast section of the park, who'd packed up at 3 in the morning and hiked out by headlamp. When rangers questioned him, expecting the usual excuses, the man just shook his head and said he'd take whatever citation they wanted to write. He was never coming back. The ranger who'd questioned him, a woman named Patricia Levine, told Bob about it later. He was scared, she said. Really scared. Not the fake kind tourists put on when they want to get out of a ticket. The real thing. His hands were shaking. He described this sound he'd heard, maybe 20 yards from his tent. Said it was like nothing he'd ever encountered. Started around 2 in the morning, some kind of vocalization, almost like it was calling to something, or calling out a warning. When Patricia pressed for details, the man had clammed up, just said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He paid his fine and left the park that same day. What bothered me, Patricia said, was his description of the sound, because I'd heard something similar myself 3 years ago, out near Heart Lake. Never told anyone because, well, who would believe it? Bob listened to these stories, collecting them, trying to find a common thread. The encounters were scattered across the park. Different years, different witnesses, but certain elements repeated. Sustained vocalizations that didn't match known animals, a sense of intelligence behind the sounds, physical evidence that appeared and vanished, and always that primal fear that made experienced wilderness professionals abandon campsites and flee. 4 years passed. Bob continued his patrols, riding deeper into the wilderness than most rangers dared. The thoroughfare region became his specialty, that remote country where you could stand on certain ridges and be further from a road than almost anywhere in the lower 48. It was brutal country, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. The kind of place that tested you constantly, that demanded respect and punished mistakes without mercy. Bob loved it, out there, away from the tourist crowds and the politics of park administration. It was just him and the wilderness, just the ancient rhythms of predator and prey, season and weather, life and death. Out there he felt most himself. It was on one of these patrols in the early summer of 1982 that Bob saw something that would change everything. He was crossing a subalpine meadow with 2 other rangers, Jason Fuller and Tom Brightwood. They'd been out for 5 days, checking on backcountry campsites and monitoring wildlife populations. It had been a good patrol. They'd seen 3 grizzlies, 2 with cubs, counted several elk herds, spotted a pack of wolves on a distant ridge, the kind of sightings that reminded you why this place needed to be protected. They were moving slow with a pack string of horses taking their time. Late afternoon sun slanted across the grass, turning everything golden. The meadow was maybe 300 yards across, ringed by dense pine forest. Wildflowers dotted the grass, purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam root. A mule deer grazed on the far side, its head down, peaceful. Bob was in the lead, Copper moving at an easy walk. He was thinking about dinner, about the trout he'd caught that morning in a high mountain lake, thinking about how good it would taste fried over an open fire. Normal thoughts, comfortable thoughts. The deer's head snapped up. Bob noticed it immediately. The way the animal went from relaxed to rigid in an instant, every muscle tense, ears forward. The deer stared at the tree line behind it, body coiled like a spring. Then it bolted, and something burst from the forest after it. Bob's hand went instinctively to his bear spray, his mind processing grizzly, predator chase, natural behavior. But that assessment died the instant his eyes registered what he was actually seeing. The creature was massive, over 6 feet tall, maybe closer to 7, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the afternoon light, making it look almost like a moving shadow. But it wasn't running on all fours like a grizzly, it was upright, bipedal, and as it ran, its arms swung at its sides in long, powerful arcs that generated momentum, not the curved, shuffling gait of a bear standing on its hind legs. This was fluid, purposeful, the movement of something built to run on 2 legs. Bob's breath caught in his throat. Behind him, he heard Jason swear softly. The speed was impossible. The creature crossed 50 yards in what seemed like seconds, eating up ground with strides that seemed too long, too efficient. Its gait was smooth despite the rough terrain, navigating rocks and uneven ground without breaking stride. This wasn't something struggling to move on 2 legs. This was something for whom bipedal locomotion was natural, normal, efficient. But what struck Bob, what made his mouth go completely dry and his heart hammer against his ribs, was the intelligence in its movement. As it chased the deer toward the far timber, it angled its approach, cutting off escape routes, using the terrain. When the deer juked left, trying to break for a different section of forest, the creature anticipated, adjusted its path without hesitation, without slowing. It herded the deer like a predator that understood tactics, that could predict behavior and respond with strategic thinking. The deer made it to the tree line a few seconds ahead of its pursuer, vanished into the shadows. The creature followed without pause, disappearing into the same section of forest. The entire encounter had lasted maybe 20 seconds. The 3 rangers sat frozen on their horses. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The meadow stretched empty before them, peaceful as if nothing had happened. The wildflowers swayed gently in a breeze Bob couldn't feel. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western peaks. "Tell me you both saw that." Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw it." Tom's response was tight, controlled. Bob nodded slowly. His hands had started to shake. He gripped the reins tighter to hide it. He'd encountered grizzlies more times than he could count, had been charged twice, both times standing his ground while his heart tried to punch through his ribs, spraying bear deterrent at the last possible second. He knew bears, knew how they moved, how they thought, how they hunted. That was no bear. Bears dropped to all fours to run. They were built for it. Their front limbs were shorter than their back legs, designed for that quadrupedal posture. When they stood upright, it was to get a better view or to appear more threatening, not to run. Their gait on 2 legs was awkward, lumbering, inefficient. They couldn't maintain it for long. What Bob had just seen moved on 2 legs with the efficiency of something that had evolved for it. It swung its arms for balance and momentum like a human sprinting, and it demonstrated tactical thinking, that ability to read and predict prey movement that suggested intelligence beyond simple predator instinct. "We should check the tree line." Tom said it, but his voice carried no conviction. None of them moved. Some instinct deeper than training kept them rooted in place. The sun was already dropping toward the peaks. Shadows were lengthening across the meadow, reaching toward them like dark fingers. The forest edge where the creature had disappeared looked very dark, very deep, and something in Bob's gut, that ancient survival instinct that had kept humans alive for millennia, was screaming at him not to go into those trees. "We need to get back," Bob heard himself say. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant. "It'll be dark in 2 hours. We're 4 miles from camp." Nobody argued. They turned their horses and headed back the way they'd come, moving faster than before. The pack animals sensed their tension and followed without resistance. Usually on the return trip, Bob would relax, enjoy the scenery, think about the evening ahead. Now his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every sound made him turn. They set up camp that night in a different location than planned, found a spot with clear sight lines, their backs against a rock outcropping, built the fire larger than necessary. None of them slept well. They took turns on watch, though they didn't discuss why, just an unspoken agreement that someone should stay alert. The next morning, they broke camp early and headed back to the station. The ride out was quiet. Each man lost in his own thoughts, trying to process what they'd seen, trying to fit it into some category that made sense. Back at the ranger station, they unsaddled the horses in silence, put away the gear. Tom and Jason headed to their cabins without much conversation. Bob watched them go, then looked down at the patrol log in his hand. What could he write? What could he put in a report? Observed large bipedal animal chasing deer in subalpine meadow? They'd be laughed at. Or worse, sent for psychological evaluation. Rangers who saw things, who filed reports about phenomena that didn't fit established categories. They didn't last long in the service. In the end, he wrote nothing, just noted the date, the location of their patrol, the routine wildlife observations, elk numbers, grizzly sightings, trail conditions, all the normal things. The creature that had crossed that meadow with impossible speed, that had demonstrated clear tactical intelligence, that had moved on 2 legs like it was the most natural thing in the world, that stayed out of the official record. But it didn't stay out of Bob's mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The image replayed constantly, the dark, shaggy form, the fluid movement, the purposeful pursuit. At night, he'd lie in his bunk and see it again. During the day, riding through the forest, he'd find himself scanning the shadows looking for that shape. He started reading everything he could find about the park's history, old journals from early explorers, reports from the first rangers, accounts from trappers and hunters who'd worked these mountains before Yellowstone became a park. He was looking for something, any indication that others had seen what he'd seen. What he found both surprised and disturbed him. The indigenous people who'd lived in this region for thousands of years had stories, many stories, about beings that walked like men but were not men, about forest spirits that should not be disturbed, about creatures that could mimic sounds, that possessed great intelligence, that moved between the worlds of human and animal. The early white explorers had documented strange encounters too, though their accounts were often dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification. Mountain men in the 1830s and 40s reported seeing large, hair-covered figures in the high country. Figures that walked upright and seemed to watch them from the forest edge. Most wrote it off as bears, but a few insisted what they'd seen was something else. Bob found references in old ranger journals too, carefully worded entries that suggested the writers had seen or experienced things they couldn't quite explain. Notes about unusual tracks, descriptions of sounds that didn't match known wildlife, incidents where experienced rangers had abandoned patrols or changed routes without clear explanation. It was all there, woven through the historical record like a thread, not prominent, not obvious, but there if you knew what to look for, a hidden history of encounters with something that didn't fit the official narrative of Yellowstone's wildlife. Winter came to Yellowstone like it always did, sudden and brutal. By mid-November, snow measured in feet rather than inches. The high country became impassable. Most rangers stayed close to the developed areas during winter, maintaining the roads that stayed open, helping the occasional hardy tourist who ventured into the park during the off-season. But Bob volunteered for a winter patrol into the southeast corner. 4 rangers on skis, following old game trails into country that wouldn't see another human until spring. It was hard, Dangerous work, the kind that reminded you how small and vulnerable humans really were in the face of true wilderness. They left in late January, when the snowpack had stabilized enough for travel. The temperature was 12 degrees below zero. The sky was that hard, brittle blue you only see in deep winter. Their breath froze in the air. Ice crystals sparkled on every surface, turning the landscape into something magical and deadly. Bob was paired with 3 other rangers: Ellen Rodriguez, who'd worked the park for 8 years and was one of the best backcountry skiers Bob had ever seen; Michael Thompson, a newer ranger but solid and reliable; and Kevin Price, a veteran who'd been at Yellowstone almost as long as Bob. They traveled in single file, breaking trail through 3.5 feet of powder. Ellen led, her movements smooth and efficient. Bob followed, then Michael, with Kevin bringing up the rear. The only sounds were the swish of their skis and the creak of their packs. The forest around them was absolutely still, locked in winter's grip. They were 2 days into the patrol when they found the tracks. Ellen saw them first. She stopped so suddenly that Bob nearly skied into her. She stood motionless, staring at the ground, her breath creating small clouds in the frozen air. "Bob," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Bob skied up next to her and looked down. His breath caught. Footprints, large footprints, cutting across their path in a straight line, heading deeper into the wilderness. The prints had punched through 3.5 feet of snow, nearly to the ground. Each impression was clear, distinct, undistorted by wind or subsequent snowfall. Fresh, made within the last few hours, maybe less. Bob pulled off his glove despite the cold and knelt beside the nearest print. His bare hand traced the outline, feeling the compressed snow, the definite shape. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he didn't care. He needed to touch it, needed to verify it was real. The print was 18 inches long. He could see the impression of 5 toes, clearly defined despite the snow. The overall shape was humanoid but elongated, not a bear. Bears had a distinctive pad shape and claws that extended beyond the toes. These were different, and the stride length, the distance between prints, was enormous. Whatever had made these tracks had very long legs and moved with purpose. Michael and Kevin had caught up now. All 4 rangers stood in a loose circle around the tracks, staring down at them in silence. The implications were staggering. "Could it be someone's idea of a joke?" Michael suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. "Someone on snowshoes making fake tracks?" Bob shook his head. "We're 20 miles from the nearest road, in the middle of winter. Nobody else is out here." He pointed at the depth of the prints. "And look how deep they are. Whatever made these was heavy. Several 100 pounds at least." Ellen had already pulled out her camera and was photographing the tracks from multiple angles. Kevin moved along the trail, examining each print carefully. "The stride is consistent," Kevin called out. "Not like someone hopping or trying to fake it. This is natural gait. Whatever made these was just walking normally." He paused at one particularly clear print. "And it was moving fast. These aren't the short steps of something being careful. This thing was covering ground." They followed the tracks for over a mile. Bob documented everything with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. Photographs from multiple angles, measurements of length, width, stride, notes on depth, clarity, direction of travel. They marked the location on their map, noting landmarks and elevation. The trail led deeper into the wilderness, into terrain so remote that only the most experienced backcountry travelers ever ventured there. Trees closed in on both sides, creating a corridor of shadow even in the middle of the day. The sky above was a flat grey dome, heavy with the promise of more snow. Eventually they had to make a decision. Continue following the tracks and risk being caught out after dark, or turn back. Bob looked at the others. Ellen's face was flushed with cold and excitement. Michael looked nervous. Kevin's expression was unreadable. "We should turn back," Bob said finally. "We're losing daylight and we're miles from our planned camp location. This snow will preserve the tracks. We can document this properly." Nobody argued, though Bob could see the reluctance in Ellen's eyes. She wanted to follow those tracks to see where they led. So did Bob, if he was honest with himself. But they had to be smart. Getting caught in this country after dark in this cold was a death sentence. They skied back to their camp as the sun touched the peaks. That night, Huddled around a small fire, they discussed what they'd found. Each person offered theories. A bear, though none of them believed it. Someone's elaborate hoax, though that made no sense. Some kind of natural phenomenon that created track-like impressions, though nobody could explain how. "What if it's real?" Ellen said finally. "What if there's something out here that we don't know about? Something that's been here all along, that's learned to avoid us?" Michael laughed nervously. "Come on, you're talking about Bigfoot. That's not real. It's folklore, myth." "Is it?" Ellen's voice was sharp. "We just followed clear tracks through deep snow for over a mile, tracks that don't match any known animal, made by something heavy enough to punch through 3.5 feet of powder. That's not folklore. That's physical evidence." Kevin had been quiet, staring into the fire. Now he spoke up. "I've been working Yellowstone for 23 years. I've seen things that made me question what I thought I knew. Heard sounds I couldn't explain. Found signs that didn't match the books." He looked around at their faces. "We're not the first to find tracks like this. We won't be the last. The question is, what do we do about it?" They debated it late into the night, what to put in their report, how to document this without sounding crazy, how to be truthful without destroying their credibility. In the end, they decided on a cautious approach. Document the tracks thoroughly. Include all the photographs and measurements. File a report that stuck to observable facts without speculation. Large bipedal tracks observed in southeast backcountry. Origin unknown. Tracks documented and photographed for further analysis. They completed their patrol and returned to the station 4 days later. Bob developed the photographs himself in the small darkroom, examining each image carefully. The tracks were clear, undeniable, physical evidence that something large and bipedal had walked through that wilderness. He filed the report as agreed. It went into a file, and the file went into a cabinet. Bob waited for some kind of response, an investigation team, follow-up questions, something, but nothing came. The report disappeared into the bureaucracy. Life went on as if those tracks had never existed. But Bob couldn't let it go. He kept the photographs, made copies, stored them in his personal files. Physical evidence that would be there long after he retired, long after anyone could claim he was misremembering or exaggerating. Spring returned to Yellowstone with the usual drama. Snow melting in torrents, turning creeks into raging rivers. The landscape transforming from white to brown to green in the span of weeks. Wildflowers erupting across the meadows. Elk calves and bison calves taking their first wobbly steps. The annual miracle of renewal. Bob returned to his regular patrols, riding the high country trails as the snow receded. Checking on backcountry campsites, monitoring wildlife populations, making sure the wilderness was ready for the influx of summer visitors. It was during one of these patrols, in early May of 1985, that Bob had the encounter that still gives him chills decades later. He was approaching the Howell Creek cabin with 2 other rangers, Stan Muella and Dennis Yamamoto. The cabin was a simple structure, built decades ago as a shelter for rangers on extended patrols. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides, a place of safety and refuge in the deep wilderness. They were 400 yards out when Bob heard it. That sound. The one he'd heard at Fan Creek 7 years earlier. But this time, he was close. Very close. The sound came from beyond the cabin, deep in the timber where visibility dropped to nothing. Bob pulled his horse to a stop, one hand raised. Behind him, Stan and Dennis halted as well. The horses immediately went tense, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. The vocalization was rhythmic, almost mechanical in its precision. Bob's hand moved to his watch, timing it without conscious thought. The sound would build to a peak, hold for a moment, then descend, pause, then start again. He counted 26 seconds per cycle. Exactly, not approximately, exactly 26 seconds. It was organic but wrong. The sound had tonal qualities that suggested vocal cords, breath, living tissue, but the precision was mechanical. Animals didn't vocalize in perfect time intervals. They responded to stimuli. Their calls varied based on circumstances, emotion, need. This didn't vary. It just repeated, cycle after cycle, with mechanical precision. Bob had heard every animal call in these mountains, the bugle of elk during rut, rising and falling with the bull's need to intimidate rivals and attract females, the howl of wolves, each animal's voice distinct, the pack joining together in a chorus that strengthened social bonds, the grunt of bears, short bursts of communication, the scream of mountain lions designed to freeze prey in place, the trumpeting of swans, the call of ravens, the chirp of pikas, the chatter of squirrels. He'd catalogued them all over 3 decades. This matched none of them. The sun was touching the peaks now, bleeding red across the sky. Shadows stretched long across the clearing where the cabin sat. Bob's horse, a gelding named Ranger, who'd been with him for 5 years, refused to move forward. The animal planted its feet and trembled, eyes rolling white. Stan's horse was equally spooked. Dennis, a newer ranger who'd only been with the park for 2 years, had gone pale. His hand was on his sidearm, though what good a pistol would do against something they couldn't see, Bob didn't know. The sound continued. It seemed to penetrate everything, resonating in Bob's chest, in his bones. He could feel it vibrating through the saddle, through the reins, as if the sound itself was a physical presence. His teeth ached with it. His eyes watered. The pressure in his skull built until he thought his head might split. "We need to get to the cabin," he managed to say. His voice sounded strange, distorted by the sound. "Now." They rode the last 400 yards quickly, the horses responding to the urgency in their riders. Bob's training took over, moving automatically through the routine of unsaddling, getting the animals into the small corral behind the cabin, carrying the gear inside. All while that sound continued, unbroken, filling the valley. They got inside and shut the door. The thick log walls muffled the sound slightly but didn't block it entirely. Bob moved to the window, peering out at the forest. Darkness was falling fast now. The trees were becoming silhouettes against a deep blue sky. "What is that?" Dennis's voice shook. The young ranger had his pistol out now, checking the load for the 3rd time. "What's making that sound?" Bob shook his head. He'd moved to the table and pulled out his notebook, documenting everything with shaking hands. Time, exact location, description of the sound, the animal's reactions, the precise 26-second cycles. If nothing else, there would be a record, evidence that this had happened. Stan had taken up position by the back window, watching the corral. The horses were bunched together in one corner, as far from the forest as they could get. Ranger was still trembling, his coat dark with nervous sweat. The sound continued for 37 minutes. Bob timed every second, 90 cycles, each exactly 26 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. Complete. Absolute. No insects, no wind, no nightbirds calling. The forest held its breath. They sat in that cabin through the longest night of Bob's life. They took turns on watch, though nobody really slept. Every creak of the logs settling made them start. Every rustle outside had them at the windows, peering into darkness lit only by starlight. Nothing approached the cabin. Whatever had made that sound didn't come closer, but Bob felt its presence out there in the trees, felt it watching, waiting. The same sensation he'd had at Fan Creek all those years ago, the certainty that something was aware of them. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to grey to pink. With full daylight, some of the tension eased. They made coffee, ate a cold breakfast from their packs. Nobody talked much. The experience had shaken all of them, even Stan, who'd been a ranger for 15 years and prided himself on never being rattled. At 7 a.m., Bob made the decision to investigate. We need to document this. Whatever made that sound was approximately 300 to 400 yards from here. That's our job. We document and report. Dennis looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. Stan checked his rifle, making sure he had a round chambered. They left the cabin together, moving carefully through the timber. The forest looked normal in daylight. Sunlight filtered through the pines, creating patches of light and shadow. Birds had started calling again. A squirrel chattered from a nearby branch, the ordinary sounds of wilderness coming back to life. They reached the area where Bob estimated the sound had originated. He'd triangulated it last night based on volume and direction. They searched methodically, covering the ground in a grid pattern, looking for any sign of disturbance. They found nothing. No tracks in the soft forest floor, no scat, no hair snagged on branches, no broken vegetation or disturbed ground, no sign that anything had been here at all. The forest was pristine, undisturbed, as if whatever made that sound had left no physical trace, or knew how to cover its tracks. They searched for 2 hours, expanding the grid, checking every square foot of terrain. Bob photographed the area extensively, documenting the lack of evidence as thoroughly as he'd documented the sound itself. Sometimes what you don't find is as important as what you do. When they finally gave up and returned to the cabin, Bob felt a profound sense of frustration. They'd heard something, all 3 of them, plus the horses. It had been real, undeniable, physically present. But now there was nothing to show for it except their testimony and Bob's meticulously detailed notes. They packed up and headed back to the station later that morning. The ride out was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts. When they reached the trailhead and unsaddled the horses, Stan pulled Bob aside. "What are you going to put in your report?" Bob had been thinking about that all morning. The truth. What we heard, when we heard it, how long it lasted. Observable facts. Stan nodded slowly. "You know they won't investigate. They'll file it away and forget about it." "Probably. But at least it'll be on record. Someone else hears it, maybe they'll find my report. No, they're not crazy. No, they're not the first." "And if they think we're crazy," Bob shrugged, "then they think we're crazy, but I'm not going to lie about what happened. I'm not going to pretend we didn't hear that." Stan clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a better man than me, Bob. I'm putting suspected wildlife activity in my log and leaving it at that. I've got a pension to think about." Bob understood. Hell, part of him wanted to do the same thing, but he couldn't. He'd been carrying these experiences for years now. The sound at Fan Creek, the creature in the meadow, the tracks in the snow, now this. At some point, staying silent became its own form of dishonesty. He filed his report. Incident time, location, detailed description of the sound, the animal's reactions, the search for evidence. He noted the lack of physical traces, attached photographs of the search area, made no speculation about what might have caused the vocalization, just the facts, carefully documented. The report went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. Bob never heard another word about it. No follow-up, no investigation, no questions. It was as if the incident had never happened. But Bob knew it had. He had his notes, his photographs, and he had Stan and Dennis as witnesses, even if neither of them would speak about it officially. That summer, Bob started really digging into the park's archives. Not just ranger reports, but everything. Old newspapers from nearby towns, historical society records, personal journals donated to the park's research library. He was looking for something, any pattern that might help him understand what he'd been experiencing. What he found both fascinated and disturbed him. The lake music. He'd heard of it before, vaguely, but never paid much attention. Now he read every account he could find. The phenomenon had been documented since the park's earliest days. Since before it was even a park. 1872, the Hayden expedition, one of the first scientific explorations of Yellowstone. A team of geologists, artists, photographers and guides sent to document this strange land of geysers and hot springs. Among them was a geologist named Ferdinand Hayden Bradley, known to his colleagues as F.H. Bradley, a meticulous scientist who kept detailed journals of everything he observed. On July 27, 1872, Bradley and several expedition members were camped on the shore of Yellowstone Lake. It was early morning, the sun just up, the lake calm and mirror-smooth. They were preparing breakfast when they heard something that made them all stop what they were doing. Bradley's journal entry, which Bob found preserved in the park's archives, read, "While getting breakfast, we heard every few moments a curious sound between a whistle and a hoarse whine, whose locality and character we could not at first determine. The sound increased in force, and it became evident that gusts of wind were passing through the air above us, though the pines did not as yet indicate the least motion in the lower atmosphere. The entire expedition heard it, Not one person, but a dozen. Scientists trained in observation, guides who'd spent their lives in wilderness, all witnessing something they couldn't explain. The sound seemed to come from overhead, moving across the sky. It would grow louder, then fade as if something was passing over them. But there was no wind at ground level. The lake surface remained smooth. The trees didn't move. Bradley and the others debated what could cause such a phenomenon. They discussed it around the campfire that night, each proposing theories: atmospheric conditions, geological activity, unknown properties of the lake itself. But none of their explanations truly satisfied them. They called it lake music, and it was documented in scientific journals, in official expedition reports, not folklore, not legend, observed and recorded by trained scientists. Bob kept reading. The phenomenon appeared again and again throughout the park's history. 1899, Captain Hiram Chittenden, an Army engineer assigned to Yellowstone, a man known for his precise, undramatic reports. Bob found his journals in the archives, pages of careful observations about roads and infrastructure and geological formations, not a poetic bone in the man's body. But even Chittenden couldn't remain clinical about the lake music. His entry read, "A most singular and interesting acoustic phenomenon of this region are strange and indefinable overhead sounds, which have been noticed by many persons, and are variously described as resembling the ringing of bells, the distant discharge of artillery, or the rumble of thunder. They are heard only in the vicinity of certain lakes and always appear to come from overhead. Bell sounds, artillery, thunder, different descriptions, but all suggesting something powerful, something that resonated through the air itself, and always described as coming from overhead, as if something was passing through the sky." 1893. Edwin Linton, a biology professor from Washington and Jefferson College. He'd come to Yellowstone to study the park's wildlife and plants. What he experienced instead shook his scientific worldview enough that he published an account in the journal Science. Linton described being near Shoshone Lake when he heard a rather indefinite reverberating sound, characterized by a slight metallic resonance. The sound appeared to come from directly overhead and to pass off across the sky, growing fainter and fainter toward the southwest. Metallic resonance. Bob paused on those words. That matched what he'd heard at Howell Creek. That quality to the sound that seemed both organic and mechanical, natural and artificial at the same time. He kept digging, finding more accounts. A ranger in 1937 named Neil Miner, who'd investigated the phenomenon and written a report theorizing about horizontally moving whirlpools of air created by wind flowing down from the peaks. But Miner's own data contradicted his conclusion. The sounds occurred in calm weather, on still mornings with no wind. A popular science article from 1930 suggesting mild earthquakes magnified in underground caverns, but seismic records showed no correlation between the sounds and earthquake activity. Temperature inversions affecting sound conduction, wind patterns, atmospheric pressure differentials, theory after theory, none of them fully explaining the phenomenon, because the scientists were starting with the assumption that the lake music must be natural, must have a conventional explanation. Bob read account after account, each describing the same basic phenomenon, a sound from overhead, moving across the sky, described variously as organ music, metal cables crashing, beating wings, harp tones, human voices, different descriptions but the same underlying experience. Something in Yellowstone skies that produced sounds unlike anything that should exist. And then Bob found something that made his blood run cold. A personal journal from a ranger named Thomas Whitfield, who'd worked Yellowstone from 1963 to 1979. The journal had been donated to the archives after Whitfield's death in 2001. Bob almost missed it, filed away in a box labelled Personal Papers Miscellaneous. Whitfield's entries were sporadic, not daily logs, but occasional notes about interesting or unusual events. Most were mundane. A particularly impressive elk herd, a grizzly encounter, weather observations, but one entry dated August 14, 1976 stood out. Heard the sound again last night, third time this summer. Same area near Heart Lake, always between 2 and 3 a.m. It's not the lake music like they described from the old days. This is different. Comes from the forest, not the sky. But it has that same quality, that same wrongness. Like something that shouldn't be making noise but is anyway. Tom Patterson told me once that there are things in these mountains that don't fit the books. I'm starting to believe him. Bob sat back, staring at that entry. Tom Patterson, the same man Frank Delaney had told him about. The foreman who'd led that trail crew in '73, who'd found the deboned elk and heard those terrifying howls at Mountain Creek. Whitfield's journal continued. Talked to an old outfitter named John Running Deer last week. Shoshone, been guiding in this area since the 40s. He said his people have stories about beings in the mountains, calls them forest walkers. Says they're not spirits, not animals, something in between. Says they've always been here, long before we showed up with our roads and our hotels. Says they know how to stay hidden. But sometimes they want to be heard. Sometimes they call out, marking territory or warning others away. He wouldn't tell me much more than that. Said some knowledge isn't meant for outsiders. Bob copied the entire entry, photographed the pages. This was gold. A ranger from a previous generation who'd experienced the same things Bob had, who'd asked the same questions, who'd tried to find answers. He kept searching through Whitfield's journal, looking for more references. He found several scattered entries over the years, each brief, carefully worded, but all suggesting Whitfield had encountered something in Yellowstone that he couldn't fully explain or openly discuss. Bob realized he was part of a continuum, rangers across generations experiencing these phenomena, documenting them privately but staying silent publicly, each one thinking they were alone in this, each one afraid to speak up for fear of ridicule or worse. How many others were there? How many rangers had heard unexplainable sounds, seen strange tracks, witnessed things that didn't fit the official narrative? How much evidence existed, scattered across private journals and unofficial notes, never making it into the historical record because the system had no place for it? Late that summer, Bob heard about another incident. A ranger named Patricia Levine came to him after her shift, looking troubled. She'd just taken a report from 2 campers at Greba Lake. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said. They were sitting on the porch of the ranger station, the sun setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. "I don't know why I'm telling you exactly, except Frank Delaney said if anyone would listen, it'd be you." Bob waited. Patricia was in her early 30s, relatively new to Yellowstone, but experienced in wilderness work. She'd spent 5 years as a ranger in Alaska before transferring south. Not someone prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. "I took a report today from 2 guys who'd been camping at Grebe Lake, both experienced outdoorsmen. One of them, Gerald Hutchins, has been a Yellowstone bus driver for 15 years, knows the park inside and out." Bob's attention sharpened. Gerald Hutchins, the same outfitter who'd been with him at Fan Creek 10 years ago. The same man who'd heard that sound and gone pale. Patricia continued. They said something happened on their 3rd night out there, around 2 in the morning. They were sleeping under the stars, no tent, just sleeping bags. Something woke them up. She described what the men had reported. Heavy breathing nearby. Very close. Then vocalizations that rose and fell, cycling through frequencies that seemed designed to inspire fear. Something circling their position, breaking branches, moving with significant weight. A strong smell, musky and organic. The encounter lasting roughly 15 minutes before whatever it was moved off into the forest. In the morning, they found where something had stood in the grass, pressed down vegetation in a circular pattern. Some impressions in soft earth near the tree line, but too degraded to be useful. Bob listened without interrupting. When Patricia finished, he asked, "What did you put in the report?" "Probable bear activity." Patricia's expression was pained. "What else could I put?" "But, Bob, I've worked around bears for a decade. In Alaska, I dealt with grizzlies and brown bears regularly. These men knew bears too, and they were both absolutely certain this wasn't that." She paused, looked out at the darkening mountains. "I heard something similar myself, 3 years ago, out near Heart Lake. Never told anyone because who would believe it? But it's the same description. sustained vocalizations that don't match known animals, a sense of intelligence behind it, that primal fear that makes you want to run. Bob nodded slowly. How many others do you think there are? Rangers who've experienced these things but stay quiet? I don't know, but probably more than we'd guess. Frank says you've been looking into this, that you've had your own encounters, Bob told her. Not everything, but enough. The sound at Fan Creek, the creature in the meadow, the tracks in the snow, the incident at Howell Creek. As he spoke, Patricia's expression shifted from skepticism to recognition to something like relief. So I'm not crazy, she said quietly. That's what I keep thinking, that maybe I misheard, misremembered, misinterpreted, but if you've experienced it too, if others have. You're not crazy, Bob assured her. Something's out there. I don't know what, but it's real. They sat in silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Patricia spoke again. What are we supposed to do with this? We can't report it officially. Can't investigate properly. Can't even talk about it openly without risking our careers. We document it, Bob said. Privately, carefully, but we document it. We talk to each other, share information, build a record, so that someday, if the time comes when this can be discussed openly, the evidence will be there, the testimony will be there. We'll have done our jobs. Patricia nodded. You're building a case file. In a way, an unofficial one, but yes. Over the next several years, Bob did exactly that. He collected stories from other rangers, always informally, always off the record. Some were willing to talk, others clammed up, afraid even of private conversations. But slowly a picture emerged. The encounters were scattered across the park, but certain areas came up repeatedly. The thoroughfare, the Fan Creek drainage, Heart Lake, Grebe Lake, Mountain Creek, Shoshone Lake, remote areas, far from roads and tourist facilities, places where true wilderness still existed. The phenomena clustered into a few categories: unexplained vocalizations, sustained and purposeful, large bipedal tracks that didn't match known species, brief sightings of large, hair-covered figures moving with intelligence and purpose, physical evidence that appeared and vanished, and always that sense of being observed, of some presence in the forest that understood you were there and chose whether to reveal itself. Bob also discovered that similar reports existed from other wilderness areas, other parks, other wild places where humans were visitors rather than residents. It wasn't just Yellowstone. Whatever this was, it wasn't confined to one location. The years passed. Bob continued his patrols, riding deeper into the backcountry than ever. He was getting older now, in his 50s, but the wilderness still called to him. He still loved those long days in the saddle, crossing ridges where the view stretched for miles, camping beside high mountain lakes where the stars reflected so clearly you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. And he remained alert, always listening, always watching, hoping for another encounter, another piece of evidence, another chance to understand what was sharing these mountains with him. That chance came in the spring of 1989. Bob was on a solo patrol, something he did less often now but still insisted on occasionally. There was something about being completely alone in the wilderness that sharpened the senses, that made you more aware of everything around you. He was camped near the thoroughfare, in a spot he'd used dozens of times before, a small clearing beside a creek, protected by a rock outcropping on one side and dense timber on the others. He'd built his fire, eaten dinner, and was sitting with his back against the rocks, sipping coffee and watching the stars emerge. The night sounds were normal at first, the rush of the creek, an owl calling from the forest, the occasional splash of a trout rising to take insects from the water's surface. Bob felt at peace, completely in his element. Around 11 p.m. the sounds stopped. Bob noticed it immediately. The sudden silence that fell over the clearing like a blanket. No creek sounds, no owl, no rustling in the brush. Even the wind seemed to have died. He sat up straighter, setting his coffee aside, his hand moving to the bear spray at his belt. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Bipedal, moving through the forest on the far side of the creek. Not trying to be quiet, but not crashing through the brush either, just walking. steady, measured steps that spoke of confidence and purpose. Bob stood slowly, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond his small circle of firelight. The footsteps continued, paralleling the creek bank, maybe 50 yards out. Whatever was making them was on the far side of the water, moving through terrain Bob knew was rough and rocky. The footsteps stopped. Bob's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to pack up and hike out by headlamp. But another part of him, the part that had spent 3 decades in wilderness work, the part that needed to understand, kept him rooted in place. A sound emerged from the darkness, a vocalization, low at first, almost subsonic. Bob felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Then it rose in pitch, modulating through frequencies that seemed to layer on top of each other. Not quite howling, not quite singing. Something in between that made the hair on his arms stand up. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence again. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away now, heading deeper into the wilderness. Bob listened as they faded into the distance, growing fainter until he couldn't hear them anymore. Only then did the normal night sounds return. The creek, an owl in the distance, the wind sighing through the pines, as if the forest had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Bob stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, his mind racing. That had been different from the other encounters, more direct, as if whatever was out there had been checking him out, observing him, maybe even trying to communicate something, though Bob had no idea what. He didn't sleep much that night. Sat with his back against the rocks, the fire built high, waiting for dawn. In the morning, he crossed the creek and examined the area where he'd heard the footsteps. Found impressions in the soft ground near the bank, large impressions, partially obscured by leaf litter, but definitely there. He photographed them, measured them, added them to his growing collection of evidence. That encounter stayed with Bob more than the others, because it had felt intentional, not a chance sighting or an unexpected sound, but a deliberate interaction. Whatever was out there had known he was in that clearing, had approached, had vocalized, had moved on, as if checking in, marking its presence, saying, "I'm here, I know you're here. This is my forest too." Robert Jackson retired from the National Park Service in 2004, 30 years of service. Commendations for his work protecting Yellowstone's wilderness, the respect of colleagues and the grudging respect of poachers and illegal outfitters who'd learned not to underestimate him. He'd given 3 decades to these mountains, and they'd given him purpose, meaning, and mysteries he'd never fully solved. For years after retirement, Bob stayed quiet about his experiences. The culture of silence was too ingrained, the fear of ridicule too strong. He went back to Iowa to his family's bison ranch and tried to settle into a quieter life. But the encounters haunted him. The sound at Fan Creek, the creature in the meadow, the tracks in the snow, the vocalization at Howell Creek, the footsteps by his camp, all of it stayed with him, replaying in his mind, demanding to be acknowledged. In his 70s now, Bob started telling his story, not for attention, not for fame. He was an old man with nothing to prove, but he felt people deserved to know what was really out there, beyond the boardwalks and tourist overlooks, what existed in the deep wilderness that so few people ever truly experienced. His testimony is measured, careful. He doesn't claim to know what he encountered, doesn't use sensational terms or make grandiose claims. He simply states the facts. He heard sounds that don't match known wildlife. He saw a creature that moved with intelligence and purpose on 2 legs. He found footprints that don't fit known species. Other credible witnesses, experienced rangers and outdoorsmen, corroborated these experiences. These aren't the reports of tourists who saw a bear and thought it was something else. These are accounts from trained professionals who spent careers in wilderness environments, who knew every animal in the park intimately. When people like that say they encountered something that doesn't fit established categories, their testimony carries weight. Consider what Yellowstone is. 2.2 million acres of wilderness. The thoroughfare region alone encompasses hundreds of square miles of country where no roads reach, where you can stand on certain ridges and be further from a road than almost anywhere else in the continental United States. Miles upon miles of dense forest, carved by ancient glaciers, pocked with caves and rock formations that haven't been thoroughly explored. The ecosystem is intact. Healthy populations of grizzlies, wolves, mountain lions, wolverines, vast herds of elk and bison. If the land can support apex predators that require hundreds of square miles of territory each, could it support something else? Something that's learned to avoid human contact? Something intelligent enough to understand our patterns and habits well enough to remain hidden? The indigenous people who lived in this region for thousands of years had stories. The Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Nez Perce, all had accounts of beings in the mountains, forest walkers, stick Indians, stone giants, different names but similar descriptions, tall, hair-covered beings that walked upright, that possessed intelligence beyond animals, that should be respected and avoided. We dismiss these as folklore, primitive mythology, stories told around campfires to frighten children. But what if they were based on genuine encounters? What if the native peoples who lived intimately with this land for millennia, who observed it with the careful attention of people whose survival depended on understanding their environment, knew something we've forgotten? Bob's encounters span the 70s and 80s, but reports continue to this day. Modern rangers still hear unexplained sounds, still find unusual tracks, still have experiences that shake them. The difference is the silence, the understanding that some things don't make it into official reports, that to advance in the Park Service, to be taken seriously, you learn what can be discussed and what can't. How many rangers have private journals like Thomas Whitfield's? How many have collections of photographs like Bob's, showing tracks that don't match known species? How many lie awake at night, replaying encounters they can't explain to anyone without risking their credibility? The lake music continues too. Modern witnesses still report it. Campers and hikers near Yellowstone Lake and Shoshone Lake still hear those strange sounds, overhead noises that don't match any known natural phenomenon, tones that seem both organic and mechanical, sounds that move across the sky as if something is passing over. In 2015, a supervisory park ranger named Christine Brunsman experienced the lake music during a winter patrol. She reported it openly, described it in an interview with a travel website. Her description matched those from Bradley in 1872, from Chittenden in 1899, from Linton in 1893. The same phenomenon still occurring, still unexplained after 140 years. What connects all these phenomena? The sounds Bob heard filling entire valleys, the creature that crossed the meadow with impossible speed and obvious intelligence, the massive footprints punched through deep snow, the lake music that has defied explanation for over a century, the encounter at Grebe Lake where something circled campers in darkness, the footsteps by Bob's camp that last night in '89. The characteristics overlap in compelling ways. Sounds that seem intelligent, purposeful. Physical evidence that appears and sometimes vanishes. A presence that understands how to avoid sustained human contact. Intelligence in movement and behavior that goes beyond simple animal instinct. Vocalizations that don't match anything in the known catalogue of wildlife sounds. And always, that sense of being observed, of sharing these mountains with something that possesses awareness, that makes choices about when to reveal itself and when to remain hidden, that seems to operate by rules we don't understand. Bob Jackson spent 3 decades protecting Yellowstone's wilderness. He rode through country where one mistake could be fatal. He faced down charging grizzlies and survived blizzards that killed less experienced rangers. He pulled injured hikers out of the backcountry and tracked down poachers in terrain most people couldn't even reach. He wasn't a man who scared easily. He wasn't prone to imagination or exaggeration. When he tells you something is out there, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about wildlife, you have to consider seriously that he's right. The evidence exists, in patrol logs and private journals scattered across decades, in photographs of tracks that don't match known species, in corroborated testimony from multiple credible witnesses, in scientific publications documenting acoustic phenomena that remain unexplained, in the continued reports from rangers who experience these things but remain silent publicly while documenting them privately. Yellowstone is ancient. The land itself formed through volcanic forces that dwarf human comprehension. The hotspots beneath, the geysers and hot springs, the explosive history written in layers of ash, all speak to deep time and powerful forces. The ecosystem has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. We've been studying it scientifically for less than 200. We like to think we understand Yellowstone, that we've mapped every trail and catalogued every species, that we've solved its mysteries and tamed its wilderness. But 2.2 million acres is vast. Much of it has never been thoroughly explored. Much of it remains genuinely wild in a way that's increasingly rare in modern America. The park holds secrets, in the deep wilderness beyond the trails, in places where tourists never venture, where even experienced rangers go only occasionally after the sun sets and darkness claims the forest. Something moves. Something makes sounds that fill entire valleys with tones that shouldn't exist. Something leaves evidence that doesn't match known animals. Something possesses intelligence that suggests more than simple instinct. Rangers know. The old-timers pass stories to new recruits in quiet conversations late at night, when the station is quiet and nobody else is listening. Not officially. Never officially. It's not in the training manuals or the orientation packets. But the knowledge is there, passed down through generations like folklore, except this folklore is based on direct experience. The understanding that Yellowstone contains more than the guidebooks acknowledge, that the wilderness is deeper and stranger than tourists realize, that there are sounds in those mountains that don't belong to any animal in the books, that there are tracks that shouldn't exist, that there are shapes moving through the forest at the edge of perception that make even experienced rangers check their weapons and build their fires higher. Bob Jackson's message is simple and direct. Keep an open mind. Pay attention. If you spend time in the deep wilderness, really listen. Not just for the sounds you expect, the elk bugles and wolf howls and bear grunts, but for the sounds that don't fit, the sustained vocalizations that seem too purposeful, the rhythmic cycles that suggest intelligence. Watch for signs that don't match the field guides, tracks that are almost human but not quite, impressions that suggest bipedal locomotion by something much larger and heavier than any person, evidence of presence without obvious source. And understand that nature keeps secrets, that 2 million acres of wild mountain country is plenty of space for something to remain hidden if it wants to be. That evolution favors intelligence and adaptability. That we've been surprised before by the discovery of animals we thought didn't exist. That our knowledge, for all our scientific advancement, remains incomplete. The rangers who patrol Yellowstone's backcountry today know. Maybe not all of them, maybe not even most, but enough have had experiences they can't explain. Enough have heard sounds that shouldn't exist. Enough have found tracks that don't match the books. Enough have felt that sensation of being watched, of sharing the wilderness with something that understands you're there. They carry that knowledge quietly, professionally, knowing that some things can't be put in official reports. Some things have to be experienced firsthand to be truly understood. Some things exist in that grey area between the documented and the dismissed, between the proven and the unexplained. The mystery remains. After all these years, after all the reports and documentation and witness testimony, we still don't have definitive answers. We have evidence, we have credible witnesses, we have documented phenomena, we have accumulated testimony spanning multiple generations, but we don't have the kind of ironclad proof that science demands. We don't have clear photographs or DNA samples or a body. We have footprints and sounds and sightings and experiences. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe the wilderness needs to keep some secrets. Maybe knowing with absolute certainty would diminish something essential about these wild places. The mystery, the sense that not everything is known or controlled or understood. That's part of what makes wilderness truly wild. Part of what makes it necessary. Or maybe we're just not looking hard enough. Maybe we're too quick to dismiss evidence that doesn't fit our expectations. Maybe the proof is out there, scattered across that vast landscape, waiting for someone with the resources and determination and open mind to find it and document it properly. Someone who can spend the time in the deep backcountry, who can approach the investigation with scientific rigor, while also respecting the limitations of studying something that seems determined to avoid sustained human contact. Bob Jackson's story is true. The lake music is documented fact, published in scientific journals, and observed by trained researchers over more than a century. The encounters at Grey Bay Lake and Mountain Creek and Howell Creek and Fan Creek all happened. Multiple witnesses corroborated them. The footprints in the snow were real, photographed and measured. The sounds that filled those valleys were real, experienced by seasoned professionals who knew the difference between normal wildlife vocalizations and something else entirely. The creature that crossed the meadow was real, seen by 3 rangers simultaneously in good light. These aren't stories made up for entertainment. They're not folklore passed down through generations and embellished with each telling. They're recent accounts from credible witnesses, reporting what they experienced with their own eyes and ears. They're documented in private journals and unofficial reports and personal photographs that exist as physical evidence. What they represent, what they mean, remains one of Yellowstone's greatest mysteries. But they happened. That much is certain. The evidence exists, the testimony stands, and the phenomenon continues to this day. Still unexplained, still challenging our assumptions about what's possible in the wilderness we think we understand. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching Void Case Files. Remember to hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers by New Year. We're posting daily, bringing you more cases like this, more deep dives into the unexplained. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the wilderness keeps its secrets. But that doesn't mean they aren't real.